Thank you to our team, of course, gratitude to our team and gratitude to each of us who are with us today. Well, yesterday was our day in the park. Yesterday, many of us came out to Shirley Chisholm State Park. It was awesome. It was outstanding. It was simply divine. It was tranquil. The scenery was green. The water was there. It was absolutely beautiful experience. A lot of connecting and fun and bike riding and walking and eating and relaxing. And the weather was on our side as it warmed up and the sun was shining. So thank God and thank each of you who came out to connect and to fellowship and to come together as one in the one. What a beautiful experience. And so today our lesson is entitled The Power of Spiritual Non-Resistance. The power of spiritual non-resistance. Now, this is not a blanket statement, this statement of non-resistance. It's not a blanket statement that, for example, in the face of injustice, we stand and we watch, but rather a look at how we unconsciously and sometimes consciously resist our good. It doesn't refer to inactivity, but it refers to an inner activity that goes on within. So most of us have heard the saying, what you resist persists. What you resist will persist. For example, it may be as simple as a chore that you have to do around the house, or a task that you have to complete. And there's a resistance sometimes to getting it done. And this resistance, if this chore is not tackled, if this task is not done or left undone, this resistance just kind of grows heavy within ourselves. You know that feeling when you know you have to do something, or you know something should be done, and it just starts growing. It just starts growing within you, that feeling of heaviness in the heart and in the mind, until eventually we begin to go about it and we tackle it and we get it done, and we finally feel a lightness and a peace. And if we don't, then it begins sometimes to morph into a greater challenge and may even create negative effects on other people, putting up this resistance to our good, or this resistance to what we need to get done. There may be interactions that you have with other people who have different values and different beliefs. And how do we respond to that? Or do we respond to that? Is there resistance? Maybe someone suggests another way of getting something done. And what's our initial reaction? Do we put up resistance? Now, I'm not talking about resistance because we know that what's being suggested is unprincipled, or resistance because we already know through life experience that doing something that way does not work out the best way. I'm talking about just putting up resistance to something that's really good for us, or someone has another opinion, and we put up this blockages, we put up this shield of resistance. Well, as metaphysicians, we know that when we are resisting, energy is being given, power is being vested in the very thing that we're resisting. Energy is being given to, and power is being vested in the very thing that we're resisting. So knowing that and understanding that, why do we resist? And what is it that causes resistance in our life experience, in our daily living? Well, resistance is generally created by limiting thoughts and beliefs or fears. Resistance is generally created by our limiting beliefs, thoughts, and fears. By how we think and believe something or someone should or should not be or do. It's generally connected to how we think and believe that something else or somebody else should be doing, should not be doing, how they should be or how they should not be. And we put up resistance because we believe it should not be that way. For example, one may say, my partner should, my spouse should, XYZ, you fill in the blank. My supervisor at work should, ABC, you fill in the blank. My children should or should not, ABC, XYZ, you fill in the blank. Resistance to what is, to what we many times have no control over. We pray for financial increase. It comes in the form of a job, and we resist accepting that because we say it's not the job we want. When in reality, had we accepted that good, we may have met someone on that job that introduced us to our greater good. But we put up resistance sometimes unconsciously and sometimes consciously. You may have experienced that one of the ways in which a person demonstrates spiritual maturity, excuse me, one of the ways in which a person demonstrates spiritual maturity is by understanding and implementing that understanding that every comment heard does not necessitate a reaction. That every comment heard and every activity taken by another does not necessitate a response or a reaction. That's a demonstration of spiritual maturity. When we hear a comment and we don't respond, when we see an action and we don't respond. Now, I'm not talking about a comment that is dangerous or an action that is dangerous, but a thought by someone else and we don't respond. But we choose to let it go and let it be. I'll share with you a story, an experience that I had a few weeks ago. I had an item that needed to be shipped from New York to California, and it was fragile. It was covered with glass. And so maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I met a person who was in the shipping business downtown at Borough Hall, and I received good energy from this person, good energy about who they were, what they were about, and what they were about in their business. And so I talked to them back then about this item that I may want to have shipped. And they said to me, yeah, we can do that. We can do that. And we can remove the glass so that there's no breakage. And so now at this point in time, I'm ready to ship this fragile item. And so I called the person. They remembered who I was. And I went, they said, just call me when you're coming into the store. So I was going into the store this day and I called the person and they said, just come. Yes, someone is there. I'm not there, but someone is there. So when I reached the store and told the person that I was told to call, they got on the phone with the owner and gave me the phone. And I said to the owner again that I remember that you said that the glass needed to be removed so that there would be no breakage. And the owner said to me, I never told you that. How did I respond? Now, 30 years ago, I would have had a quite different response. But at this point, I thank God for growth and development. And I continued the conversation of where it needed to go, when I needed it to arrive, and the confirmation that I needed in order for it to arrive safely. When I left the store and I left the item in the store with the person, the worker in the store, they packed it very nicely, sent me a picture of the packaging. And I thought to myself, had I responded, had I resisted and responded to that statement that was made and was made with such negative energy, this entire situation could have turned out differently. That item could have been not packaged with that kind of care. And it was a very valuable item. And it may not have reached the destination in California unscratched. It reached there unscratched because of the way it was packed and the care that it was given in the package. Had I responded differently, I am sure the situation would have turned out different. The power of non-resistance to the things in the outer world that happen every day, and not every activity requires or necessitates our response. You see, in reality, this form of non-resistance is stronger than resistance. Why? Because this form of non-resistance appeals to the divinity within ourselves. It appeals to the divinity within ourselves. It is the Christ within ourselves demonstrating itself rather than the ego running amok and creating more havoc than the situation calls for. So spiritually, non-resistance doesn't necessarily mean doing nothing. It doesn't mean necessarily being passive or complacent or inactive and just waiting for manna to fall from heaven into our lap. It means that the doing is a non-reactive outward expression. It's the appearance of not doing, while at the same time, there's a keen and sharp awareness going on within. The inward activity is happening. The inward activity is processing. And the Christ is giving the message and the guidance and the way of how to respond. I have heard it said that when I myself am being very quiet, not in anger, not in turmoil, but in spiritual activity, that when I am being very quiet, and I have seen that same demonstration in you, when you are being very quiet, there is an inward activity that's going on. An inward activity that's happening that guides the outer response. So non-resistance is a thoughtful, divinely guided response, more so than an ego reaction. It's a thoughtful, divinely guided response as opposed to an egoic reaction. And when action or reaction is necessary, because there are times when it is necessary, the reaction comes under the guidance of the Christ self and not the ego. You see, the ego would lead us to believe that resistance is strength. The ego will lead us to believe that resistance shows strength and is our strength. When truthfully, hardcore resistance is a weakness. Hardcore, consistent resistance is a weakness that blocks the sound and the activity of the inner voice of God, which is the true power. It's the activity, this resistance of the ego. Remember that thoughts and feelings that are being expressed with the greatest intensity and the highest vibration is the dominant thought, the dominant feeling, the dominant action, and the dominant happening. So wherever we place our thoughts, our feelings, those are going to be our actions and reactions. Last week, if you remember, we spoke about thoughts and feelings and actions that cause us to think or feel or act as if we are separate and apart from God. Remember that? That there's no connection, that there's no oneness. These are egoic thoughts and feelings. This reactive response to some of the activities of life, this resistance is one of the ways that creates this separation, this thought and this feeling of separation between us and God. And when we experience that separation, we said last week, that we respond to life differently. We respond to life from sometimes a negative standpoint, from not the highest standpoint. And we miss the opportunity, we miss our good because of our response, because of our resistance, because the ego was in lead and would have us believe that resistance is our power. When non-resistance, spiritual non-resistance is the power, because it opens up the way, it opens up the passage, it opens up the channels of our hearing from God. The essence of non-resistance to good is unity, oneness. Oneness as substance of God. The essence of non-resistance, the essence of spiritual non-resistance is oneness. Oneness as a substance of God, and responding from that oneness, that knowing of that oneness. Resistance will wreak havoc in the nervous system. It causes the body to be tense and irritated, and it saps our energy mentally, physically, and emotionally. Resistance. Think of the times that you have put up resistance to something and you stiffen, and you can feel it in your body temple, and it doesn't feel good. But when we relax and demonstrate non-resistance, doesn't mean that we don't respond, but within us, there's a non-resistance. Within us, there is something going on that guides us how to respond to that situation. In truth, my friends, there is no valid or sustainable opposition to spiritual non-resistance. There's nothing that we can say is valid or sustainable in opposition to spiritual non-resistance, because spiritual non-resistance is God. Spiritual non-resistance is of God. Spiritual non-resistance is the activity of the Christ self. So there's nothing valid, nothing that is sustainable in opposition to that. It's a thought in our mind and maybe a feeling in our emotions, but it's not a truth. You see, it's by surrender that we no longer need or no longer desire the defenses of the ego self. It's by surrendering to God through the Christ self, that we no longer are in need of the masquerade that the ego self provides as a defense. And at that point, we just feel quite at ease and relaxed in the situation and feeling good about self in our skin. And yes, non-resistance sometimes requires becoming vulnerable. It requires sometimes that we become vulnerable. And you know, when we're vulnerable, we're open to others who may not be where we are spiritually to take some kind of shots at us. And I don't mean physical shots, but I mean saying things that may be hurtful, or saying things that may be distasteful. So yes, sometimes non-resistance requires us to be vulnerable, but that is a strength. Vulnerability is a strength. It shows that you are comfortable in your skin. You are comfortable at who you are and whose you are, and yet you know who you are and whose you are. And sometimes that in that vulnerability, we can become hurt. The human self can become emotionally disturbed. But remember, there's no hurt in God. God does not know hurt. So it's the human self that becomes hurt. But vulnerability is a strength. And sometimes it's required when we want to live in a state of non-resistance. It's through letting go of this resistance that sometimes we practice and appropriately becoming vulnerable that we discover the strengths that we did not realize were within us. When we can become more open and vulnerable. Remember when we were children and we would say, sticks and stones would hurt my bones, but names will never harm me. Being vulnerable, comfortable in our skin, knowing what we're about and who we are, whose we are, what we are. Vulnerable to the point that whatever is said, we know that it is not true. Because we've grown beyond that point, and we can allow ourselves to be open and to share and be vulnerable and not to resist every single thing that comes along and experience that tightness and that tenseness. It's the time when worldly effects will roll off of our back and we just bless the situation or bless the persons in the situation and leave it be. Leave it to God. Leave it be. So let's take a look at overcoming this conscious and sometimes unconscious resistance that we tend to demonstrate in our life. Well, the first thing that's necessary is we have to become aware that we're in a state or that we're practicing at a particular time, mental or emotional resistance. The body will feel it and let you know. The body becomes tense, the mind shuts down to what's being said or what's being done, and there's no receptivity going on. But remember that resistance is only a thought of how we think someone should be or do, or something should be or be done. It requires change in our thoughts. It requires trust in God. It requires willingness rather than willfulness. It requires releasing some of the guilt we may be feeling from past experiences, or some of the shame we may be feeling from past experiences, and forgiving ourselves and others. This non-resistance. It requires release and surrender to the divine self, the Christ self. It requires trust, my friends, and willingness, and letting go, and letting God do the work. Tanya stated in the meditation that non-resistance, spiritual non-resistance, is a standard. It is a standard. It's a Christ standard. It's rising up in our Christ self. It's responding from the Christ self. It's not being afraid to respond from that position because we know who we are. So we're always getting back to growth and growing and developing and unfolding. We're always getting back to prayer and meditation. We're always getting back to practice, practice, practice. We cannot reach that point in life that we want to reach without practice, practice, practice. When we flow in the flow of spirit, situations change. When we flow in the flow of spirit, and spirit is using us to create something in the outer, situations change, and in the process, because the flow is flowing through us, we transform when we're in the flow of spirit. So what is going to be your response? Your conscious response to some of the same situations. You know, when someone in your household, or it can be anyone, not necessarily in your household, but someone responds with something that just irks you. It just irks you. And maybe in the past you've said, here we go again. Maybe in the past we've said, are you ever going to let go of that? Maybe in the past we've said, I don't want to hear that again. What's going to be your response going? Could it be like Jesus to just go apart? Just go apart for a while and just let the process within, that inward process, work and take place. So that when we come back to the situation, there's a situation of non-resistance. Non-resistance. Maybe a discussion that needs to be had. Maybe a statement that needs to be made in love, rather than a reaction that only causes to fuel fire. Going against the flow creates stagnation. And we just continue to go around and around, going against the flow. And we just go around in circles, around, and it's the same thing over and over and over again, going against the flow as opposed to stopping and hearing what needs to be said and what's being said inwardly, approaching the situation with spiritual and from a standpoint of spiritual non-resistance. You see, spiritual non-resistance to the goodness of God is an act of love. Spiritual non-resistance to the goodness of good. Good and God are synonymous. To the goodness of good, to the goodness of God is an act of love. It's an act of love of God, love for God, love of self, and not love of self from an ego-centered way, but from an appreciative and grateful standpoint. Love of others and love of all of God's divine creation. Spiritual non-resistance is an act of love. The ego would have us believe that resistance to our good is strength. Spiritual non-resistance is an act of love. It's a power of God that we allow to be demonstrated in and through us. Spiritual non-resistance. The scriptures today, Romans 13 and 10, reminds us that love fulfills the requirements of God's law. And some versions of the Bible say that love is the fulfilling of the law. And that is true. God is love, God as love. And when we are living and demonstrating from that standpoint, we are fulfilling the law. The other scripture from Matthew 5 and 9 reminds us that blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. They will demonstrate God activity. They will show themselves as an offspring of God. Blessed are the peacemakers. And that doesn't mean that we know something is wrong and we just pat it. And we give it what we call a spiritual bypass. When you know something's wrong and you feel something's wrong, but we just bypass it. We call that a spiritual bypass, where we don't know necessarily how to respond to something. And so we just don't calm ourselves and center ourselves so that we can get the best response. When we listen to the daily word today, it reminded us that I am one with the presence of peace. I am one with the presence of peace. And that the greatest comfort is when we are filled with the awareness of our oneness with God. Oh, Jesus. When we are filled with the awareness of the oneness with God and as God. When we are filled with the awareness of that oneness, we don't get into consistent resistance. When we put up resistance at that point, we're putting up resistance based on principle, spiritual principle. But we're not putting up resistance to every new idea that we hear, every action or reaction that someone else has, every situation that we come into and we think could be done differently, could be done better, and maybe it could. But we don't come through the door with that action, with that thought process, and pounce it onto others, that we stop and just let go and just go within and let the activity that's going on within flow and flow with it. It takes spiritual maturity to not respond to every oot and every ot, to every saying, to every action, to every situation. It takes growth and maturity, spiritual maturity, to arrive at that position. And I have seen you demonstrate that. And maybe you're not aware that that's a demonstration of spiritual maturity, but it is. Don't allow it, these situations, to sap your energy. Make a conscious decision of where you will vest and invest your energy for the best and the greatest outcome. And so, my friends, as you move through this week, give this some thought and link it to last week's lesson on oneness, oneness as God, oneness with God. And see how the times when we may be exercising some form of resistance, that it makes us feel as though we're separate from God, and that is not possible. But it makes us feel and think that we are separate and apart from God when there is only oneness. We as God substance, we as good substance. Jesus said, I and the Father are one. You can also say God or I and God as one. Go forth in this week, practicing spiritual non-resistance. Let the stuff go. Others will grow as they need to grow. They will arrive at the point where they need to be in consciousness at the appointed time. Vest your energy in goodness, in godness, in spiritual non-resistance. And know that the only thing we have control over is our own thoughts, feelings, actions, and reactions. God bless you. I bless you. Namaste. And so